We're going to look at Roman and then later handwriting, and I'm starting with a text that is quite easy to read, or at least to pick out the letters. It's a text of the poet Virgil, who was in some ways the writer of the great national epic. And the first thing to say is that although it's handwritten, it's a whole lot of capital letters that look like stone-cut ones. And the date, as you see, is quite late, towards the end of the Roman Empire itself. So how did the Romans write? Well, that's Roman handwriting. Rather spindly, written with a pen made of a rather thin reed on something called papyrus, which is a kind of made-up writing surface, which didn't last very long, but was quite comfortable to write on. So here is a Roman text, and I've picked out line 5 with the low words eusque denarios, and I should say that some letters are very easy to understand. The O of eusque, the S is a bit spindly, and that has a whole lot of developments. Well, there we are. We won't go into the detail of it. But that's the way writing would have been done in about 200. Something happened to Roman writing, and rather later, a couple of hundred years later, it became much more flowing and curved. And again, I've picked out a couple of lines here. Sam, which is clearly part of a word, vilissimam, and then egareto, exact. Now these letters not only flow, but they join into each other, and we ought to have a look at the way that happens. Some letters are absurdly familiar. The third letter at the top is an M, the way we would do it ourselves, followed by a U. But the very first letter, Sam, or the S of Sam, is an S. Well, that would have a long life too, and we'll be seeing that. Sam vilissimam, so 2 S's in that word, and so on. And the next line has some very, very elaborately joined letters. One which I'll pick out, because in a way it gives us the letter we know today, is a kind of link in the letters R, E, T, U. The E and the T join together. The E is the sort of E we might make. The line that comes from it is the T, which has kind of got turned through 90 degrees, and then joined onto the U. Well, we might not read it easily as E and T, but it's certainly the origin of the character on the right, which you'll find in every keyboard. And it's the E and the T, which stands just for and in any language. And one of the words for it is ampersand. And just to give you an idea how long-lasting it was, here is a 16th century italic by a great master of italic letters, Robert Grandjean, and it's certainly one of the finest examples of that joined E and T. We might just notice, if we're talking about ENT or and in Latin, that there was another character for writing ET, and you've got it here in this line from Gutenberg's Bible. The first line here is, in fact, teram. The line over the A means an M has been left out. Et. And that curious character that follows teram is a shorthand way of writing et. And Tyro here was in fact a professional secretary to the writer and politician Cicero. And we'll see that character come up in other forms of writing and type. And in fact, we can see it in this type specimen. We're going a bit ahead here. Ratdolt, a German, did some work in Venice, and he had a type made for him, which is one we'll be coming to. It's a Gothic type. And he has in his second line here, ingenio et mirifica. Well, that 7-like character is again the Tyro's version of an and. Let's come back to earlier writing. That flowing Roman writing settled down, and for some rather important books, especially the scriptures, the Christian texts of the Gospels and the Bible generally, they were written rather more slowly and often on rather grander surfaces like vellum, an animal skin. And so some of the characters settled down a bit and were written more carefully. There's one character, or one bit of a character, that we ought to just notice. Top line, you've got an L and a D. In the second line, which I've written out for you, a nihil extraordinarium. The H and L of nihil and the D of extraordinarium is thick at the top. That's a double line. That's a kind of loop you can just about see in the top right. 2 lines, one written over the other to make it swell out. Now that's a character that will run and run, and in a way we've still got it in Roman type today, and we'll come to all that. Well, there we are. That was called a half uncial because the uncial character, which we won't go into here, was a really rather big type of letter. So this is the half-size version, and in a way it's what gives us our modern lowercase. If we go on, we come to a Christian gospel, the Gospel of St. Luke, in fact, quite a lot later, about 700. And this is very much the same writing, but again, very, very carefully written. The big text here is Latin, et Lucas Evangelista. Curiously, there's another smaller writing on top of it, written maybe 300 years later in, we could call it Old English, it's Anglo-Saxon. And if you want to look at and characters, there we've got them, because et Lucas Evangelista has in Anglo-Saxon the Tironian and character, like a 7, the Gospeler. Well, there we are. That's small letters, which are moving towards the letters which we use every day. Under the major political figure, don't know what to call him, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, you have a kind of move towards a united Europe, and he gets himself made with the title of emperor. He went to Rome to be crowned, and he got a kind of writing stabilized. And in this case, we see the writing of Charlemagne, or Carolingian as it's called, used for a book about constellations. Not for astronomy really, but because constellations could be used to calculate time and seasons. Piscis Magnus habet stellas 12, so duodecim. Well, it's not difficult to read, except that curious spindly S, the long S, is the only one that was used. So Piscis Magnus habet. Now that is H-A-B-E-T, but the E-T is an ampersand. So there's that character. It doesn't look like either an E or a T, but there it is. And here's a rather larger version of this script, which I'm showing because, of course, it is, in the end, it's the origin of our lowercase, of Roman type, which we'll come to. It's a psalm, that is a book of the Old Testament, and we can read most of the words here. The second one in the black line at the top is regnavit, iras cantor populi. The first word is Dominus, Lord, but since that's a holy name, the writer doesn't spell it out. Still, the rest of it is very easy to read. The second black line is qui sedet, who is seated, and again the E-T of sedet is an ampersand, so that's a character that will run and run. And as I've said, it's one you'll find on your keyboard today. Well, we won't pause there, we'll be coming back to it, because that is the origin of Roman type in the end. Something curious happened to the rather broad, well-spaced Carolingian hand. It got made more compact. It shrunk. And so here is what's really fairly legible, but it's the same writing condensed, if you like. And so here we are around about 1300. And then a rather strange thing happens, and that does have typographical connections. Not much later, that flowing but condensed writing freezes into something which is angular. Textura is a kind of technical name for it, meaning like a textile, a kind of woven fabric. But there it is, written quite big here. And it's full of what would be characteristic of what became known as Gothic. It has all kinds of special characters. That first line reads hic inclinator, meaning here he bows, but incline is easy to read. What's that Z doing? Well, that's an abbreviation, and we'll see those coming into this writing. The actual text here is the Catholic words of the Mass. Te igitur, this is but the bottom left here. And again, the igit you can see here. The little twiddle at the top of the T means that a UR has been left out. And then clementissime, pater, and so on. Well, that's the text we've been looking at. Te igitur clementissime pater. And that is the Catholic Mass. Staying with the same character just once more. As you see, it's cramming big letters onto a small column. And on the right-hand side here, in line 5, it's supplices rogamus. Us? Well, yes, that's the little 9 character after R-O-G-A-M, and the 9, that's just an abbreviation for us. Well, there we are. This is the way writing would go, and it wouldn't make it easier to read. But anyway, that's the character we've been looking at, and this angular form would stay with us for a very long time indeed. Here, for example, quite a lot later, is what is known as the Book of Hours, which was a kind of, not a church book, but they're holy texts to keep in the house. And they're often quite elaborately decorated. If you've got money enough to get one of these books written for you, you make it look fancy and put images into it. And so here is a rather fine French example. But as you can see, it's the same angular, rigid character. Dixit Dominus, Domino, meo, sede ad dextris meis. Am I reading that from the page? Well, not really. It's a text that anyone properly brought up should know is the Latin text of a psalm. The Lord said to my Lord. The important thing here is the grandness of the manuscript. And very grand it looks too. I said I'm not reading it because I know the text. Well, let's try that out a bit. Look at, for example, one word here. Can you read it? Can you read it? Well, when you've broken letters like I and N and M and U down to a series of the same strokes, it isn't really that easy to sort them out unless you already know what you're reading. You might prefer to have it spelt out with Roman type. So that's what it says. Inimicorum. Well, there we are. That is one of the disadvantages of a very rational, perfect character like the textura. There were other forms of Gothic, and maybe we should look at them, not least because they really are quite decorative in many ways. This, by the way, I don't think is very well written. It's a little bit later, about 1500, and that first line, tans corda et renes deus, has another of these and characters. Between corda and renes, you've got a 7. Well, that's the and character. And by the way, I'm saying there are 2 forms of R. In corda, which is a word for heart, the R, C-O-R-D-A, the R is a curved letter which is fitted into the curve of the O. After the and, you've got renes, which is kidneys actually, but the R is quite different, R-E-N-E-S. So 2 forms of R, confusing, but that's the way it was in this rather rounder form of the Gothic letter. Well, not every manuscript was very, very carefully written with a holy text. Here's a handbook of plants, a so-called herbal, of about the same date. Piloselle, ou Pelusite. The name of the plant, Piloselle, is in a bigger script, and then it goes on to handwriting, ou Pelusite. C'est une herbe qui croît au pied des montagnes, and so on, des montagnes. Well, this is handwriting. It's rather carefully done and quite decorative, and it would have its part to play in typography too, as we shall see. Here's a rather more carefully drawn version of the script used for that big letter, for Pilisette. This, from the Low Countries, is a prayer in what would become the Dutch language. I think it's very, very fine calligraphy indeed, but it's written with a rather flexible pen. And one result of using this pen is that certain letters get joined together. In the second line here, D-O-E, are all joined up, and the D-E of that word, the curves merge together. And that's a letter which would go on being used. We'll see some other examples. Here is, frankly, something like handwriting, which should interest us because the 4 lines below are Gothic handwriting. The one above is a kind of Italian hand, and we'll come to that later on. But the 4 lines are written out by Hendrik van den Geer, to give him his Dutch name, Henri Dutour, if you're giving his name in French. And he worked for Christophe Plantin, a Frenchman who worked in Antwerp as a printer. And these are types for which Plantin had matrices for casting them. A Roman type by Garamond. And he's put 2 R's in here, G-A-R-R-A-M-O-N-D. The next one down is an italic of Grandjean, someone we'll come to. The third is a Flamande, a Flemish type that he cut himself by, well, Henri Dutour. And then the last line, a Greek. I promise you that second word there, G-R-E-C-Q, of Grandjean. Not easy for us to read, but it's certainly decorative. And here finally we come to English, or rather we come to a heading in Latin in the New Italian hand, Hic est calix Novum Testamentum, and then you have the English for that. This is the chalice, the New Testament in my blood, and that is in this form. It got the name of bastarda or batard because it's a kind of mix of handwriting and careful slow Gothic. So batard or bastarda is what it got called. And as you see here, it could be very decorative, but it's a heading letter, slowly down, and after 3 lines it then goes into the English text. Here you see that by the words of our Saviour, rehearsed by St. Matthew, well, again, not hugely easy to read, but that is English writing. It got called secretary hand because these are the words that would be written out for you by a professional writer or secretary. And it's one we come up to. In this, which I don't pretend you can read in that size, because this just might be Shakespeare's writing. It's a fragment which is in the British Library, and it's worth looking just a bit closer. Nay, certainly you are, for to the King God hath his office lent, of dread, of justice, power and command. Well, there it is. Maybe Shakespeare, maybe not. And that's as far as we shall go today.